So as I said, what we've done here is we've taken first some of the work that we've done in the past with our 2010 report on New York City's public financing system and some interviews that we did with candidates to talk to them about their incentives and really how the New York City public financing system changed their incentives and encouraged them to reach out to small donors, to donors within their own communities rather than targeting the same wealthy few whom they might otherwise depend on to fund their campaigns. And they told us that that's exactly what they were doing. So to give you just a couple of quotes, we had one four-time city council member say that regular New Yorkers who never thought of contributing now get excited about doing so. They don't feel dwarfed by big money interests. And again, the reason why that happens, what everyone has been talking about here today, is that there's a match. People's money is amplified and their voice is amplified through the matching system. And of course we had City Council Member Jumaane Williams say that his opponents had access to big money in a way that he didn't, but that matching funds helped him keep up with them in fundraising, and that the availability of those funds makes it absolutely easier for someone like him, a non-traditional candidate, someone who doesn't have connections and money from the establishment, to run for office in New York and ultimately to prevail in his campaign. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to take these propositions and go further with them and see if we can illustrate them. And in order to do so, we had great collaboration, very kind support from Professor Malbin and his colleagues at the Campaign Finance Institute, who gave us their data from the 2009 City Council elections that allowed us to really graphically illustrate through maps of New York City, the city that we know, who is actually giving the money. We talked about the numbers of small donors and how there's a paradigm shift in Professor Malbin's terms to the participation of small donors, but we didn't talk about where they come from. And that was the enterprise that we undertook here to take that data, and I want to just say thank you. I know that there's a former colleague of Professor Malbin's who's here today who was very instrumental in producing that data, Peter Russo, so thank you so much to him. We took that data and we created some maps that we wanted to share with you today. So the first map that I want to show you, this is a map of New York City block groups in which individual donors gave over $1,000. So what you're looking at here in red is any block group in which a donor, at least one donor, gave over $1,000. And it may not shock you to learn there are not many such block groups. Most of the map is empty. The sort of yellowish part of the map is a place where no one could afford to give that money. And so you'll see very heavy representation on Manhattan's Upper East and Upper West Side. I won't try to name all of the places, but you can see how heavily concentrated those areas are and that they correlate very closely with predominantly wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods in New York City. Then we moved down quite substantially, we thought, to donors over $175. And again, you're looking at the same thing. You're looking at either no donors at all over $175 or at least one donor who gave over that amount. And you're seeing that there's significant improvement, certainly, from 1,000 to this point, but you still see a lot of parts of the map where there's no representation at all, where no one was able to give over $175. And again, without trying to name all of them, you see significant parts of Queens and Brooklyn, of Upper Manhattan, and particularly the Bronx, where no one was able to give over $175 to a candidate. And then, of course, we looked at donations between $1 and $175, and now you see a totally different map. You basically see New York City the way that we actually see it in real life, where only the uninhabited portions of New York City are not colored in, and so you have somebody giving money from every block group, basically, where people live. And I think the reason to pause here and the reason to think about this again, and this goes back to what you've heard the other panelists say, is that this is not a foregone conclusion. It's not just that there are smaller donations and so more people can afford to give them, and so you have a map that looks like this. Without candidates reaching out to small donors and mobilizing their constituents and saying, we want to be funded by the people we want to serve, people wouldn't be incentivized to give even what they might be able to afford to give. So this map and the kind of representation of participation in the political process that it represents is really made possible by New York City's program. So this map is a little bit more complicated visually, but it does make a little bit of a distinct point. What we did here is, instead of just focusing on the binary question of whether at least one person gave or no person gave between $1 and $175, we actually broke the numbers apart and looked at how many donors gave within each census block group. And so we started with blue. Here, blue is 0. And we sort of ratcheted up the intensity of the colors from light green to yellow to orange to red, and red represents the most donations in a single block group. And what I think this illustrates that the other map doesn't is, you could have looked at the other map and said, well, yes, but maybe it was just one person giving in every single one of those census block groups, and that wouldn't be very compelling. But what this shows you is that there actually are tremendous swaths of New York City, including, as we'll get to in a moment, areas that have a lot of low-income residents and a lot of residents who are minorities who are giving in really substantial numbers. And that is something that, again, is very much unique and a testament to New York City's system and the way it incentivizes candidates to reach out all over the map in the way that we see here. So I just want to focus on what it means to get this kind of coverage all over New York City. I think traditionally when we hear donors, unfortunately our association is donors are high-powered people. They're people who have a lot of money. That's what we hear in the media. That's what we see in our culture. And so it's really important to think about who are these folks all over the map. Again, as I just showed you, we're giving. And so this is a map that, that really illustrates the distribution of voting age residents in New York City who are living at or below the federal poverty line. And I think one thing that it really illustrates is how concentrated low-income residents are in New York, how heavily concentrated they are in just in certain areas. And so when you see representation and significant representation in that prior map, those 2 prior maps of donors from those areas, that's really telling you that candidates are reaching out to constituents where they live and getting contributions and getting support and participation in low-income areas as well as the traditional bases of political donors. And so we didn't just look at low-income communities, we also looked at race, and we looked at the distribution of different racial minorities throughout New York City. Here, you see the African-American population, and in a second I'll show you the Hispanic population and also the Asian population in New York City. And one thing that really struck me as I was looking at this map is that New York City continues to be segregated to a very large extent, and you can't walk away from the map when you see that. It's very apparent. And again, you see heavy concentrations of black residents in parts of Brooklyn and Queens, and obviously in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, and I'm not including all the areas, but you'll see that they're really clustered together in certain communities. And again, when we look at the map that shows the kinds of participation rates that we've seen all over New York City, including in all these areas, that is something that is very different from what you see among traditional donors and what you see when candidates are only incentivized to go to the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side for their wealthy donors. And I won't belabor the point, but I'll show you here the maps of Hispanic residents in New York City. Again, you'll see the same thing, that when candidates are targeting donors in their own communities, they're really reaching out to all of these different people who look like New York City looks and not like the wealthy donors look. And the same here is true of New York City's Asian residents. So we didn't stop there. We actually did a kind of a focus or a close-up on certain parts of New York City, and I'll just kind of quickly show you what we got by doing that. So this is not all of Brooklyn. This is part of Brooklyn that covers Bedford-Stuyvesant and some of Bushwick and Crown Heights. And we know this to be heavily African-American area. We also know it to be an area where there are a lot of residents who are at or below the poverty line. And this is what we see when we look at just the donors who gave more than $1,000. Here, blue means 0. Not a single person in that block group gave over $1,000. And light green, I have to say the number here means 1 to 2. And so you see that this map is basically completely blue. It shows that there were practically no people in this entire area that were able to give that amount of money. And again, we see some improvement when we look at who gave more than 175, but we also see a key where we don't reach most of the numbers that are represented there. So we're still seeing a lot of no one giving more than $175, and a little bit of a handful of people, again, per block group, and nobody giving any more than that. And then it looks completely different when we look at people who gave between $1 and $175. Just as we saw with the city as a whole, when we look at this particular area, which, again, as I said, is predominantly African American, has a really high population of residents who are below the poverty line or at the poverty line. And we see that they're not just giving. Overwhelmingly, the map is covered with people who are giving, but that they're parts where a lot of people are giving and a lot of people are mobilized and feel like they can actually participate and make a difference, and that they won't be drowned out by big money. And so we did this, I'll just go kind of quickly to show you, we did this also in Chinatown, heavily Asian area. Here again, we also see a lot of folks who are living at or below the poverty level. Again, we see the same trend, maybe a little bit less blue, but quite a bit of blue. This is, by the way, this is not the $1,000 level. This is the over 175. We skipped the $1,000 map, which looks worse than this. You can believe me about that. And then here's how it looks once you actually look at between $1 and $175. Again, you see much, much more participation, and not just by one person, but in many areas, areas that overlap significantly with the really low-income areas, you see a lot of participation. We did this for Bronx and Upper Manhattan, and not totally by accident. If you go back to one of the earlier maps, you'll see this is a very heavily Hispanic population. In New York City, again, you see tremendous poverty rates. And again, even for over $175, most of the map is blue. No one was able to give over $175. And again, once you look at between $1 and $175, you see not just participation, but participation in significant numbers. So I know I raced through those last maps. If anyone is interested in seeing them in more detail, we actually kind of pasted them out on the glass table that's right by the window. So later on when we break for the reception, you can look at them in a little bit more detail. But I think this really illustrates in a way that's kind of very compelling, especially for folks who live here and who know what the city looks like and know what these areas look like, who is actually giving, not only that we're getting more small donors, but who those people are and how they're very different from the folks that we're used to hearing dominate the political system. And the point of this for New York State, of course, is we looked at the city data. That's what we were analyzing here, but there's no reason to think that maps of New York State in comparable respects wouldn't look similar if we had similar incentives for all of the participants. So thanks so much for your attention. I'll put my moderator hat back on.